Millionaire disguises himself as a waiter to meet his rich fiancée's family. At his own restaurant, but he found out something unbearable. The crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the elegant dining room of Le Ciel, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. Amidst the gentle clinking of silverware and the soft murmur of conversation, a tall, handsome waiter moved with practiced grace between the tables. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his crisp white shirt gleamed under the ambient lighting. To the casual observer, he was just another member of the impeccably trained staff. But William Hartley was far from an ordinary waiter. As he balanced a tray of champagne flutes, his heart raced with anticipation and anxiety. Tonight he wasn't just serving guests, he was on a covert mission in his own establishment. William, the millionaire owner of Le Ciel, had donned the guise of a waiter to uncover a truth he desperately needed to know. His eyes darted to the main entrance, where the maître d' was greeting a couple who had just arrived. William's breath caught in his throat as he recognized them, Richard and Victoria Lancaster, his future in-laws and parents to his beloved fiancée, Margaret. As they were led to their reserved table, William steeled himself for what was to come. Tonight he would learn the true nature of the family he was about to join, and he prayed that his worst fears wouldn't be realized. With a deep breath, William approached their table, his heart pounding beneath his perfectly pressed waistcoat. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice disguised with a slight accent. "Welcome to Le Ciel. May I offer you some champagne to start your evening?" As Richard and Victoria settled into their seats, their eyes barely acknowledging William's presence, he knew that his journey of discovery had begun. And as he poured the sparkling liquid into their glasses, he couldn't shake the feeling that by the end of the night, his life and his love would be forever changed. As William moved efficiently between tables, he kept a watchful eye on Richard and Victoria. The couple exuded an air of entitlement, their designer clothes and flashy jewelry speaking volumes about their desire to impress. Yet there was something in their demeanor that set William on edge, a tension in their smiles, a sharpness in their whispered conversations. He approached their table again, this time to take their order. As he leaned in to hear Victoria's selection, he caught a snippet of their conversation that made his blood run cold. "Richard, darling," Victoria was saying, her voice low but dripping with disdain, "have you spoken to Margaret about those ridiculous charity events she insists on attending? It's high time she focused on more profitable endeavors." Richard's response was equally disturbing. "Don't worry, my dear. Once she's married to that millionaire boy, we'll have all the influence we need. Margaret will learn to prioritize family interests over her childish altruism." William's hand trembled slightly as he wrote down their orders, his mind reeling from what he'd just heard. Margaret, his sweet, compassionate Margaret, was being viewed as nothing more than a pawn in her parents' schemes. The realization was like a knife to his heart. As he retreated to the kitchen, William's thoughts were in turmoil. He had always known that Richard and Victoria were different from their daughter, but he had never imagined the depth of their selfishness. How could they speak so callously about their own child? In that moment, as he relayed the orders to the chef, William realized that his mission had become far more critical than he had initially thought. He wasn't just here to understand his future in-laws better. He was here to protect the woman he loved from those who should have cherished her most. With renewed determination, William straightened his tie and prepared to return to the dining room. He had a long night ahead of him, and every interaction with Richard and Victoria would be an opportunity to uncover more of their true nature. As he pushed through the kitchen doors, balancing a tray of appetizers, William silently vowed to do whatever it took to shield Margaret from the machinations of her parents. Little did he know that the evening's revelations were far from over, and the challenges that lay ahead would test not only his resolve, but the very foundations of his relationship with Margaret. As the evening progressed, William found himself witnessing scene after scene that chilled him to the core. Richard and Victoria's behavior was a far cry from the polite facade they usually presented when Margaret was around. Their true colors were on full display, and the picture they painted was anything but pretty. William watched in dismay as Victoria snapped her fingers imperiously at a young waitress, demanding a refill of her wineglass. The poor girl, new to the job and already nervous, fumbled with the bottle, spilling a few drops on the pristine tablecloth. "You clumsy fool!" Victoria hissed, her face contorted with anger. "Do you have any idea how much this dress costs? It's probably worth more than you make in a year." The waitress stammered an apology, her eyes welling with tears. William, his heart aching for the girl, was about to step in when Richard spoke up. Now, Victoria," he said, his tone smooth but his eyes cold. "There's no need to make a scene. I'm sure the management will be happy to comp our meal for this inconvenience." William felt a surge of anger. This was the kind of entitled behavior he despised, the very antithesis of the values he shared with Margaret. He approached the table, his face a mask of professional concern. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. Richard turned to him with a condescending smile. "Ah, yes, you see, your colleague here seems to be in need of some additional training. We'd hate to have to speak to the owner about this unfortunate incident." William bit back a retort, reminding himself of his role. "I assure you, sir, that we take such matters very seriously. Please allow me to take care of this for you." He turned to the shaken waitress. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'll handle this table from now on." As the girl retreated gratefully, William couldn't help but marvel at the stark contrast between Margaret and her parents. Where she was kind and considerate, they were cruel and selfish. Where she sought to lift others up, they seemed to revel in putting people down. The revelation was painful, but it only strengthened William's resolve. He knew now more than ever that he needed to protect Margaret from the toxic influence of her parents. But as he continued to serve them throughout the evening, overhearing more of their callous remarks and witnessing their disdain for those they deemed beneath them, a nagging question began to form in his mind. How much did Margaret know about her parents' true nature? And if she didn't know, how would she react when the truth came to light? As William refilled their water glasses, his mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. He realized that the path ahead might be even more challenging than he had initially thought, and that the truth he was uncovering could potentially shatter the woman he loved. With a heavy heart, William continued his charade, knowing that each moment brought him closer to a confrontation that would change everything. The night was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. As William continued to serve Richard and Victoria, snippets of their conversation drifted to his ears, painting a picture of a past he had never known. Between courses, as the wine flowed freely, the couple's guard began to lower, and their words became more candid. "Do you remember when we first met Margaret's William?" Victoria mused, her voice tinged with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "I thought for sure he was just another trust fund baby, playing at being a restaurateur." Richard chuckled, a sound devoid of any real warmth. "Oh yes, I remember. I was ready to write him off entirely, but then we found out about his real estate holdings, his tech investments. Who would have thought that scruffy-looking boy would turn out to be our golden ticket?" William felt a chill run down his spine. He remembered that first meeting well, how nervous he had been, how eager to make a good impression. He had attributed Richard and Victoria's initial coolness to natural parental concern. Now he realized it had been nothing more than cold calculation. As he cleared away their dessert plates, William's mind wandered to his own past. He thought of his humble beginnings, the long hours he had worked to build his business empire. He had never relied on his family name or connections. Everything he had achieved was through his own sweat and determination. The contrast between his values and those of Richard and Victoria couldn't have been starker, but it was their next exchange that truly shook William to his core. "You know," Richard said, leaning in close to his wife, "I almost feel bad for the boy. He clearly adores Margaret. It's almost a shame that she doesn't feel quite the same way." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, Richard, don't be silly. Margaret's feelings don't matter. What matters is that she does her duty to this family. Lord knows she owes us that much after all we've sacrificed for her." William nearly dropped the plates he was carrying. His mind reeled at the implications of what he had just heard. Could it be true? Did Margaret not love him as he loved her? Or was this just another manipulation on the part of her parents? As he retreated to the kitchen, William felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his relationship, about the family he was planning to join, was being called into question. He leaned against the cool steel of a prep table, trying to gather his thoughts. In that moment, William realized that the evening's revelations were not just about uncovering the true nature of Richard and Victoria. They were forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own relationship, about the very foundation of the future he had been planning. As he prepared to return to the dining room, William steeled himself for what was to come. He knew that before the night was over, he would have to confront not just Richard and Victoria, but his own fears and doubts as well. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same again. The evening wore on, and with each passing moment, William felt the burden of his discoveries growing heavier. As he navigated the busy restaurant floor, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: anger at Richard and Victoria's callousness, fear for Margaret's well-being, and a gnawing uncertainty about the very foundations of his relationship. It was during a lull in service that William overheard a conversation that would haunt him for days to come. Richard and Victoria, clearly feeling the effects of the expensive wine they had been consuming, were speaking more freely now, their voices carrying just enough for William to catch every damning word. "I must say," Richard was saying, a smug smile playing on his lips, "Margaret has done well for herself, even if she doesn't realize it. This marriage will solve all our problems." Victoria nodded, her eyes glittering with avarice. "Indeed. Once they're married, we'll have access to William's connections, his resources. We can finally crawl out of the hole your last business venture left us in." William felt his heart constrict. He had always wondered about the source of Richard and Victoria's wealth, had even offered to help with some investments. They had always demurred, claiming they preferred to keep business and family separate. Now he understood why. But it was Victoria's next words that truly drove a stake through his heart. "It's a good thing Margaret is so naive. Can you imagine if she knew the truth? That her precious charity work was nothing more than a ploy to catch a wealthy husband?" Richard laughed, a sound that sent chills down William's spine. "Oh, Victoria, you are wicked. But you're right, of course. All those galas, all those fundraisers, they were the perfect hunting grounds. And look how well our plan worked." William felt physically ill. The idea that his entire relationship with Margaret might have been orchestrated, that the passion they shared for helping others was nothing more than a calculated move in an elaborate con, was almost too much to bear. As he mechanically went through the motions of serving other tables, William's mind was in turmoil. He thought back to all the charity events he had attended with Margaret, the passion in her eyes when she spoke about making a difference in the world. Had it all been a lie, a performance designed to ensnare him? But even as these doubts swirled in his mind, another part of him rebelled against the very idea. He knew Margaret, knew her heart. The kindness she showed, the genuine empathy she had for others, those couldn't be faked, could they? As the weight of these revelations pressed down on him, William realized that he was approaching a crossroads. Soon he would have to make a choice: confront Richard and Victoria with what he had learned, or continue the charade and live with the knowledge of their true nature. Either way, he knew that his relationship with Margaret would never be the same. The question now was whether it could survive the storm that was brewing, or if it would be swept away in the tide of lies and manipulation that seemed to surround them. With a heavy heart, William straightened his uniform and prepared to return to Richard and Victoria's table. The night was far from over, and he had a feeling that the worst was yet to come. As the evening progressed, William found himself caught in a dizzying dance of deception. Every step he took, every dish he served, felt like a betrayal. Not just of his true identity, but of the trust Margaret had placed in him. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to end the charade, not when each moment revealed more of the ugly truth behind Richard and Victoria's polished facade. It was during the coffee service that William encountered a face he hadn't expected to see that night. Amanda Chen, one of Margaret's closest friends and a regular patron of the restaurant, walked in with her husband. As luck would have it, they were seated at a table adjacent to Richard and Victoria's. William's heart raced as he approached their table, praying that Amanda wouldn't recognize him in his waiter's attire. To his relief, she barely glanced at him as he took their order, too engrossed in conversation with her husband. But as he turned to leave, he heard Richard's voice, low and menacing, directed at Victoria. "That's Margaret's little do-gooder friend. Keep your voice down. We don't need her running to our daughter with tales of our candid moments." Victoria sniffed, disdainfully. "Please, Richard. That girl is so self-absorbed she wouldn't notice if we danced naked on the table. Besides, we have nothing to be ashamed of. We're simply looking out for our daughter's best interests." William felt a surge of anger at their dismissive attitude towards Amanda, who he knew to be a kind and attentive friend. But more than that, he felt a glimmer of hope. If Amanda overheard even a fraction of what he had witnessed tonight, she could corroborate his story to Margaret. As he moved between the two tables, William found himself in the surreal position of eavesdropping on two separate conversations, one filled with genuine warmth and friendship, the other dripping with disdain and calculation. Amanda was gushing about Margaret's latest charity initiative, her voice filled with admiration. "I don't know how she does it, juggling all her projects and planning a wedding. Margaret's amazing." Meanwhile, at the other table, Victoria was muttering, "If only." Margaret put half as much effort into securing her future as she does into these useless charities. Thank goodness we have William to set her straight once they're married. The contrast was stark and painful. William felt as though he was staring into a fractured mirror, seeing two completely different reflections of the woman he loved. One side was the Margaret he knew, compassionate, driven, full of life. On the other was the Margaret her parents saw, a pawn in their game, a means to an end. As the night wore on, William found it increasingly difficult to maintain his composure. Every word from Richard and Victoria's mouths seemed to chip away at the foundation of his relationship with Margaret. Yet hearing Amanda speak so fondly of her friend reminded him of why he had fallen in love in the first place. William knew that the moment of truth was fast approaching. Soon, he would have to drop his mask and confront the reality of what he had discovered. But as he looked at his reflection in the polished surface of a serving tray, he wondered if he would recognize himself or his relationship when all was said and done. As the clock struck 9, the restaurant's atmosphere shifted. The dinner rush was winding down and a mellow jazz tune floated through the air. William, his nerves frayed from hours of deception, was clearing a nearby table when he heard the unmistakable click of heels on the marble floor. His heart nearly stopped when he saw Margaret enter the restaurant, her elegant figure silhouetted against the dim lighting of the entryway. She was early. Their plan had been for her to join her parents for dessert, giving William time to change back into his regular clothes and meet them as himself. For a moment, William froze, unsure of how to proceed. Should he duck into the kitchen and hope she didn't see him, or should he come clean now in front of everyone? Before he could decide, Richard's booming voice cut through his thoughts. "Margaret, darling, you're early. Come, join us for a nightcap." William watched as Margaret made her way to her parents' table, her face lighting up with a smile that made his heart ache. How could he shatter her world with the truth he had uncovered? As Margaret settled into her seat, William steeled himself and approached the table. This was it, the moment that would change everything. "Good evening," he said, his voice steady, despite the turmoil in his heart. "May I offer you our dessert menu?" Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time that evening. For a heartbeat, there was no recognition in her gaze. Then confusion flickered across her face, followed by shock and disbelief. "William?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. What are you doing?" The silence that fell over the table was deafening. Richard and Victoria exchanged puzzled glances, not yet grasping the situation. William took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. "I think," he said, his voice gaining strength, "that it's time we all had an honest conversation." With deliberate movements, he removed his waiter's apron and name tag. "My name is not just William the waiter," he announced, meeting the eyes of each person at the table. "I am William Hartley, the owner of this restaurant and Margaret's fiancé. and I've spent this evening learning some very disturbing truths about the family I thought I was joining. The shock on Richard and Victoria's faces quickly gave way to anger. Margaret, however, looked devastated, her eyes filling with tears. You've been spying on us?" she asked, her voice trembling. William's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. "Margaret, But before he could explain, Victoria cut in, her voice sharp. "How dare you deceive us like this? Margaret, surely you're not going to stand for such underhanded behavior." William could see the conflict in Margaret's eyes, the battle between her love for him and her loyalty to her family. It was time to lay all the cards on the table. "Before you make any judgments," he said, addressing Margaret directly, "there are some things you need to know, things I've heard tonight that I think will change how you see your parents, and possibly how you see me." As William began to recount the evening's revelations, he could feel the weight of years of deception and manipulation beginning to crumble. Whether this would strengthen his relationship with Margaret or destroy it entirely remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. After tonight, nothing would ever be the same. The tension in the air was palpable as William recounted the evening's events. Margaret sat perfectly still, her face a mask of shock and disbelief as she listened to the ugly truths about her parents' true nature and their plans for her future. "They spoke of you as if you were nothing more than a pawn in their game," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "They mocked your charitable work, calling it useless and a waste of time. They said your kindness was nothing more than a ploy to catch a wealthy husband." Margaret's eyes darted between William and her parents, searching for any sign that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But the guilt and anger written across Richard and Victoria's faces told her everything she needed to know. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Have you been using me all this time?" Richard attempted to regain control of the situation. "Now, Margaret, you have to understand. Everything we've done has been for your own good, for the good of this family." "Your father's right, dear," Victoria chimed in, her voice sickly sweet. "We only want what's best for you. And really, William's behavior tonight is far more concerning. Spying on us, lying to you. Is that the kind of man you want to marry?" William felt a stab of fear. Would Margaret see his actions as a betrayal? Would she choose her manipulative parents over him? But Margaret surprised them all. She stood, up slowly, her eyes blazing with a mix of hurt and determination. "No," she said firmly. "What's concerning is that my own parents would treat me like a commodity to be traded, that they would belittle my passions and mock my dreams behind my back." She turned to William, her expression softening slightly. "And you should have trusted me enough to tell me your suspicions, but I understand why you felt you had to do this." William's heart swelled with hope. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I needed to know the truth, to protect you." For a moment, the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in their own world. But reality came crashing back as Richard slammed his fist on the table. "This is preposterous," he bellowed. "Margaret, you're coming home with us right now. We'll sort this mess out in private." Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Dad. I'm not going anywhere with you. I need time to think, to process all of this." With that, she turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. William watched her go, his heart breaking. He had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? As he faced the furious glares of Richard and Victoria, he wondered if he had just lost the woman he loved in his attempt to save her. The days following the confrontation at Le Ciel were a blur of emotional turmoil for William. Margaret had asked for space, and he respected her wishes, even though every fiber of his being longed to reach out to her, to explain, to make things right. He threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the restaurant, overseeing every detail with an intensity that both impressed and worried his staff. But no matter how busy he kept himself, he couldn't escape the gnawing fear that he had irreparably damaged his relationship with Margaret. It was on the 5th day of their separation that William received a text from Margaret. "Meet me at our spot in the park, 3 p.m. Their spot was a secluded bench overlooking the lake, where they had shared countless conversations and tender moments. As William approached, he saw Margaret already seated there, her gaze fixed on the rippling water. "Margaret," he said softly, his heart racing. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." She turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "William," she replied, her voice steady, "I think it's time we talked." William sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I'm so sorry," he began. "I know I betrayed your trust. I should have—" Margaret held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I've had a lot of time to think," she said. "About you, about my parents, about everything. And I've realized something important." William held his breath, bracing himself for what might come next. "What you did," Margaret continued, "was wrong. You should have trusted me enough to share your concerns. But I understand why you felt you had to do it, and in a way I'm grateful." William blinked in surprise. "Grateful?" Margaret nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "You showed me a truth I might never have seen otherwise. It was painful, yes, but necessary. I've spent the past few days confronting my parents, demanding honesty for perhaps the first time in my life. And while it's been difficult, it's also been liberating." Relief washed over William, but he tempered it with caution. "Where does this leave us?" he asked gently. Margaret reached out and took his hand, her touch sending a jolt through him. "It leaves us with a choice," she said. "We can let this break us apart, or we can use it as an opportunity to build something stronger, something based on complete honesty and trust." William squeezed her hand, hope blooming in his chest. "I want that," he said fervently. "More than anything. No more secrets, no more doubts. Just us, facing whatever comes together." Margaret's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was genuine. "It won't be easy," she warned. "We have a lot to work through, and my relationship with my parents, that's going to take time to heal, if it ever does." William nodded, understanding the challenges that lay ahead. "We'll face it all together," he promised. "One day at a time." As they sat there, hands intertwined and hearts aligned, William realized that while the truth had indeed changed everything, it had also paved the way for a love deeper and more authentic than anything they had known before. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in days, William felt a sense of peace. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side, stronger for having weathered this storm. In the weeks that followed their conversation in the ER Park, William and Margaret embarked on the challenging journey of rebuilding their relationship. They agreed to start with complete transparency, sharing their thoughts, fears, and hopes with a new level of openness. Their first step was to attend couples counseling. In the safe space of the therapist's office, they delved into the issues that had led to William's deception and Margaret's complicated relationship with her parents. "I felt so powerless," William admitted during one session. "I knew something was off with your parents, but I didn't know how to approach it without seeming like I was attacking your family." Margaret nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "And I was so blind to their manipulation," she said softly. "I always made excuses for their behavior, never wanting to see the truth." As they worked through their issues, they also focused on strengthening the foundation of their relationship. They revisited the values that had drawn them together in the first place, their shared passion for helping others, their dreams of making a positive impact on the world. One evening, as they walked hand in hand along the city's riverfront, Margaret turned to William with a determined look in her eyes. "I've been thinking," she said. "I want to continue my charitable work, but on my own terms. No more letting my parents dictate my choices or question my motives." William squeezed her hand supportively. "I think that's wonderful," he said. "Your compassion is one of the things I love most about you. How can I support you in this?" Margaret's face lit up with excitement. "Well, I have some ideas." As she outlined her plans for a new community outreach program, William felt a surge of admiration and love. This was the Margaret he had fallen for, passionate, driven, and full of kindness. He silently vowed to do everything in his power to protect and nurture this side of her. Their journey of rebuilding wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, of old fears resurfacing, But with each honest conversation, each vulnerable moment shared, they grew stronger both as individuals and as a couple. William, true to his word, remained completely transparent about his business dealings and his interactions with Margaret's parents. He invited her to be more involved in the restaurant's operations, valuing her input and perspective. For her, part Margaret worked on setting healthier boundaries with Richard and Victoria. It was a painful process, filled with heated arguments and tearful confrontations, but slowly she began to assert her independence and demand the respect she deserved. As autumn gave way to winter, William and Margaret found themselves curled up on the couch in their apartment. A cozy fire crackling in the fireplace. Margaret rested her head on William's shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "You know," she said softly, "a few months ago I thought we were falling apart, but now I feel like we're stronger than ever." William pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "We are," he agreed. "We faced the truth, as painful as it was, and we chose to grow from it. Together." As they sat there, wrapped in warmth and love, both William and Margaret knew that while their journey was far from over, they were on the right path. A path of honesty, mutual respect, and unwavering support. And that, they realized, was the truest foundation for lasting love. As the holiday season approached, William and Margaret faced a new challenge, navigating family dynamics in light of everything that had transpired. The annual Lancaster family Christmas dinner loomed on the horizon, an event that had once been a source of joy but now filled them both with apprehension. "We don't have to go if you're not comfortable," William said one evening as they discussed their plans. "Your parents would understand if we decided to skip it this year." Margaret shook her head, a determined look in her eyes. "No. I think we need to go. It's time to face this head-on. Besides," she added with a small smile, "I'm not going to let them drive a wedge between us and the rest of the family." William admired her courage, even as he worried about the potential for conflict. "All right," he agreed, "but we'll face it together, and if at any point you want to leave, just say the word." As they pulled up to the Lancaster family home on Christmas Eve, William could feel the tension radiating from Margaret. He reached over and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Remember, we're a team," he said softly. "Whatever happens in there, we face it together." Margaret nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The front door opened before they could ring the bell, revealing Victoria Lancaster, impeccably dressed as always. "Margaret, darling," Victoria said, her voice overly sweet. "And William, how lovely to see you both." The awkwardness was palpable as they entered the house. Richard stood in the living room, drink in hand, his expression unreadable. Other family members milled about, clearly sensing the tension but unsure of its source. As the evening progressed, William and Margaret did their best to engage with cousins, aunts and uncles, steering conversations away from the elephant in the room. But they couldn't avoid Richard and Victoria forever. It was during a lull in the festivities that Richard approached them, his voice low. "I hope you two are pleased with yourselves," he said bitterly. "You've turned this family upside down with your accusations." Margaret stiffened, but her voice was steady when she replied, "We didn't turn anything upside down, Dad. We simply brought the truth to light." Victoria joined them, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Perhaps this isn't the best time or place for this discussion," she hissed, but Margaret stood her ground. "No, Mom. I think it's exactly the right time and place. Our whole family is here. Let's be honest with them, for once." A hush fell over the room as other family members tuned into the conversation. William placed a supportive hand on Margaret's back, ready to step in if needed. Margaret took a deep breath and addressed the room. "I know many of you have wondered what's been going on with our family lately. The truth is, we've been dealing with some difficult revelations. My parents—" She paused, gathering her courage. "My parents have not been honest about their intentions or their feelings towards me and William." She went on to explain, in measured tones, the manipulations and deceit they had uncovered. As she spoke, William watched the faces of the family members, seeing shock, disbelief, and in some cases, dawning understanding. Richard and Victoria stood frozen, their carefully cultivated image crumbling before their eyes. When Margaret finished, there was a moment of heavy silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Margaret's elderly grandmother stepped forward. "I always knew there was something not right," she said, her voice quavering but firm. "Margaret, my dear, I'm so proud of you for standing up for yourself." One by one, other family members expressed their support for Margaret and William. Some shared their own experiences with Richard and Victoria's manipulative behavior, long-held, secrets finally coming to light. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the house shifted. There was sadness, yes, but also a sense of relief, as if a great weight had been lifted. Richard and Victoria, faced with the united front of their family, retreated to a corner, their influence visibly diminished. As they prepared to leave, Margaret's cousin Sarah hugged her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've given us all the courage to be more honest with each other." In the car ride home, Margaret was quiet, processing the events of the evening. Finally, she turned to William, tears in her eyes but a smile on her face. "That was intense," she said, "but I feel like for the first time in years I can breathe freely around my family." William took her hand, bringing it to his lips for a gentle kiss. "You were amazing in there," he said. "You stood up for the truth, and in doing so you might have just started healing your entire family." As they drove through the quiet streets, both William and Margaret felt a sense of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they had faced one of their biggest challenges together and come out stronger. Whatever the future held, they knew they could face it, armed with honesty, love, and the support of those who truly cared for them. As spring bloomed in the city, William and Margaret found themselves facing the final hurdle in their journey, their wedding day. What should have been a joyous occasion was tinged with anxiety as they grappled with the question of how to handle Richard and Victoria's involvement. The night before the wedding, they sat in their favorite spot in the park, the same bench where they had decided to rebuild their relationship months ago. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the heaviness in their hearts. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" William asked, his voice gentle. "We could still elope, you know, avoid all this drama." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'm sure. We've come too far to hide now. Besides," she added, a determined glint in her eye, "I think it's time for one last confrontation, a chance to set things right, once and for all." As dawn broke on their wedding day, William stood at the altar, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The church was filled with friends and family, all waiting with bated breath to see how the day would unfold. The music swelled, and Margaret appeared at the end of the aisle, a vision in white. But instead of Richard, it was her grandmother, who walked her down the aisle, a symbolic gesture that spoke volumes. As they exchanged vows, William could see Richard and Victoria sitting stiffly in the front row, their expressions a mix of anger and resignation. But he focused on Margaret, on the love and trust shining in her eyes, and knew that whatever happened next, they would face it together. It was during the reception that the moment of truth arrived. As William and Margaret took to the dance floor for their first dance, Richard approached, his face set in grim lines. "I hope you're happy," he said, his voice low and bitter. "You've torn this family apart with your stubbornness." Margaret stopped dancing, turning to face her father. The music faded, and the room fell silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. "No, Dad," Margaret said, her voice clear and steady. "You and Mom tore this family apart with your lies and manipulation, but today we're putting it back together, on a foundation of truth and genuine love." Victoria rushed forward, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the distress on her face. "Margaret, please," she pleaded. "Can't we just forget all this unpleasantness? It's your wedding day, for heaven's sake." William stepped forward, placing a supportive arm around Margaret's waist. "I think what Margaret is trying to say," he said calmly, "is that we can move forward, but only if we acknowledge the past and commit to honesty in the future." For a long moment, the four of them stood there, the fate of their family hanging in the balance. Then, to everyone's surprise, Richard's shoulders slumped, the fight going out of him. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've made terrible mistakes. I thought I was protecting this family, but I was only protecting my own ego." Victoria, seeing her husband's change of heart, burst into tears. "Oh, Margaret," she sobbed, "can you ever forgive us?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was strong when she replied. "Forgiveness will take time," she said. "But if you're willing to try to be honest and respect our choices, then yes, I think we can work towards it." As Richard and Victoria nodded, agreeing to Margaret's terms, a ripple of relief went through the gathered crowd. William felt as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Margaret turned to him, a radiant smile on her face. "Now," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I believe we were in the middle of our first dance as husband and wife." As the music started up again and they began to sway, William held Margaret close, marveling at her strength and grace. They had faced their greatest challenge and emerged victorious, their love stronger than ever. The road ahead would not be easy, but as they danced, surrounded by the love and support of true friends and family, William and Margaret knew that they could face anything life threw at them. Together, they had discovered the unbreakable power of honesty, forgiveness, and unconditional love. In the months following their wedding, William and Margaret embarked on a new chapter of their lives, one built on the solid foundation of trust and honesty they had fought so hard to establish. The journey of healing and reconciliation with Richard and Victoria was slow and sometimes painful, but progress was steadily made. Family therapy sessions became a regular occurrence, providing a safe space for all parties to express their feelings and work through years of misunderstandings and manipulations. It wasn't easy. There were heated arguments, tears, and moments when it seemed like the divide might be too great to bridge. But with each session, small breakthroughs were made. One particularly poignant moment came during a therapy session when Richard, his voice choked with emotion, finally opened up about the financial pressures and societal expectations that had driven him to such desperate measures. "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted to Margaret, tears in his eyes. "But I realize now that I was only protecting my own pride. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, for everything." Margaret, moved by her father's vulnerability, reached out and took his hand. It was a small gesture, but it marked a significant step in their healing process. Meanwhile, William and Margaret threw themselves into their shared passion for philanthropy. They launched a foundation that focused on providing educational opportunities for underprivileged youth, combining Margaret's compassion with William's business acumen. Their work brought them a sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal success. They were making a real difference in people's lives, and doing it together made it all the more meaningful. One evening, as they sat in their home office poring over plans for their next project, Margaret looked up at William with a smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "You know," she said, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm almost grateful for everything we went through." "It made us stronger, didn't it?" William nodded, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "It did," he agreed. "We learned the hard way that love without honesty is built on sand. But now we have a foundation that can weather any storm." As if on cue, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Victoria was asking if they'd like to come over for dinner that weekend. A casual family gathering, no pretenses, no hidden agendas. Margaret showed the message to William, her eyes questioning. Without hesitation, he nodded. "Let's do it," he said. "One step at a time, right?" As Margaret typed out a reply, accepting the invitation, William felt a surge of pride and love. They had come so far from that night in the restaurant, when lies and manipulation had threatened to tear them apart. Now they were moving forward, healing old wounds and creating a future built on mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, old habits that needed to be unlearned. But with each passing day, the Lancaster family was growing stronger, more authentic, more loving. William and Margaret's love story had not been an easy one. It had been tested by fire, challenged by deceit, and very nearly broken by the weight of expectations and manipulations. But in facing these trials together, in choosing honesty over comfort and courage over complacency, they had forged a bond that was unbreakable. As they fell asleep that night, hands intertwined, both William and Margaret knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, with open hearts, honest words, and an unwavering commitment to the truth of their love. A year had passed since the wedding, and Le Ciel was buzzing with activity. The restaurant, once the stage for deception and revelation, was now transformed for a very special occasion. William and Margaret were hosting an anniversary dinner, not just to celebrate their first year of marriage, but to mark the journey of healing and growth their entire family had undergone. As William oversaw the final preparations, making sure every detail was perfect, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The tables were adorned with centerpieces of white roses and lavender, Margaret's favorite combination, symbolizing new beginnings and harmony. Margaret arrived early, looking radiant in a deep blue dress. She wrapped her arms around William, planting a soft kiss on his cheek. "Can you believe it's been a year?" she murmured. William hugged her tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," he said. "Other times it's like we've lived a lifetime in just 12 months. They shared a knowing smile, both acutely aware of the challenges they'd faced and overcome. Just then the doors opened, and Richard and Victoria walked in. There was a moment of tension. Old habits die hard, but it quickly dissipated as Victoria stepped forward and embraced Margaret warmly. "The place looks beautiful, darling," she said, and there was genuine pride in her voice. Richard shook William's hand, then surprised everyone by pulling him into a brief, awkward hug. "Thank you," he said gruffly, "for not giving up on us, on this family." As other guests began to arrive, close friends, family members, even some of the staff who had been present on that fateful night a year ago, the atmosphere in Le Ciel was one of joy and celebration. During the dinner, William stood to make a toast. Looking around the room, he felt a surge of emotion at the sight of all these people who had been part of their journey. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady, "we stood in this very restaurant and faced some difficult truths. It would have been easy to let those truths tear us apart. But instead we chose a harder path, the path of honesty, forgiveness, and love." He raised his glass, meeting Margaret's eyes. "To my beautiful wife, who taught me the true meaning of courage and compassion. To our family, who showed us that it's never too late to change and grow. And to all of you, who supported us through it all." Margaret stood to join him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And to love," she added. "Not the fairy tale kind, but the real, messy, challenging, beautiful love that we choose every day." As glasses clinked and cheers echoed through the restaurant, William and Margaret shared a private smile. They had come full circle, back to where it all began. But this time, there were no masks, no hidden agendas, just the truth of their love, stronger and more resilient than ever. Later that night, as the last of the guests departed and they stood alone in the quiet restaurant, William pulled Margaret close. "So," he said softly, "are you ready for another year of adventures, Mrs. Hartley?" Margaret laughed, a sound full of joy and promise. "With you, always," she replied. "As long as we face them together with honesty and love, I'm ready for anything." As they shared a tender kiss, bathed in the soft glow of the restaurant lights, both William and Margaret knew that they had found something rare and precious. A love tempered by truth, strengthened by challenges, and made unbreakable by their unwavering commitment to each other. Their story was far from over. In many ways, it felt like it was just beginning. But whatever the future held, they would face it side by side, their hearts open, their love true, and their bond unbreakable. You might also like one of the two videos on the screen. Feel free to watch them now or subscribe to the channel to watch them later. Thanks for watching.